walked the streets for over 3 decades, blending into the background of American cities. A hulking figure standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, moving through bars and street corners without raising alarm. Nobody suspected that behind his ordinary appearance was someone responsible for more deaths than Ted Bundy, the Zodiac Killer, and the Golden State Killer combined. September 2012, Louisville, Kentucky. Police officers entered a homeless shelter responding to a routine warrant. They were looking for someone wanted on a minor drug charge out of California. Nothing unusual, just another name on a list of outstanding warrants. The man they found was elderly, unremarkable in appearance. He offered no resistance. He seemed like just another transient caught in the revolving door of the justice system. What investigators didn't know yet was that they had just apprehended someone who had been ending lives across the country for 35 years. Someone who had perfected a method so efficient, so carefully planned, that he had become nearly invisible to law enforcement. Between 1970 and 2005, women began disappearing from cities across America. Miami, Los Angeles, Houston, Cleveland, Cincinnati, San Diego, Phoenix. The locations varied, but something connected these cases that nobody could see. Bodies were discovered in abandoned lots, rolled down hillsides, concealed in dense vegetation. Some were found within days. Others remained hidden for months or years. Several have never been found at all. The cases went cold almost immediately. Different cities, different decades, different investigating agencies. No apparent connection. Families waited for answers that never came. Police filed reports that gathered dust in evidence rooms. Communities moved on, unaware that these disappearances were anything more than isolated tragedies. But they weren't isolated. They were connected by one person who had perfected the art of becoming invisible. This individual had developed a technique that left almost no evidence behind. No weapons were used. No fingerprints were left at scenes. No witnesses survived to identify him. The method was brutally simple, yet devastatingly effective. He used only his hands. His targets were chosen with cold calculation. Women living on the margins of society. Women struggling with addiction. Women whose disappearances might not trigger extensive police investigations. He would approach them in bars or on street corners, offering money or companionship. Once trust was established, he would drive them to remote locations where no one could hear what happened next. Then came the violence. Deliberate, controlled, final. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies and vanish, often crossing state lines before morning. Then, he would simply wait until the urge returned, sometimes weeks or months later, before starting the cycle again. This pattern continued for over 3 decades. What makes this case even more terrifying is that this person wasn't unknown to law enforcement. He had been arrested nearly 100 times throughout his life. Assault, burglary, theft, drug charges. His criminal record stretched back decades. Yet he spent only 10 years total behind bars. How did someone with such an extensive history continue to walk free? How did he manage to take so many lives without anyone connecting the dots? There were close calls, moments when everything should have ended. In one instance, a police officer actually found him in a vehicle with a deceased victim beside him. Through quick manipulation and lies, he talked his way out of the situation and drove away into the night. In another case, he went to trial with physical evidence and witness testimony linking him to a victim. The jury deliberated and returned with their verdict: not guilty. He walked out of the courtroom a free man and continued his spree for 2 more decades. Investigators would eventually confirm that his victims numbered at least 62. 62 confirmed lives taken. But he claimed the real number was much higher. 93 total victims across multiple states and spanning 35 years. 93 women who trusted the wrong person. 93 families who never got answers. 93 cases that went cold until someone finally started asking the right questions. If his claims are accurate, this makes him the most prolific offender in United States history. Who was this person who operated in plain sight for over 3 decades? How did he choose his victims? And what drove him to continue without remorse or hesitation? What finally brought his terror to an end after 35 years? And why did it take so long for anyone to realize what was happening? Most haunting of all, how many families are still waiting for answers about loved ones who disappeared decades ago, not knowing their cases are connected to the same person? This is the story of Samuel Little, and how America's deadliest criminal hid in plain sight for 35 years. Samuel McDowell. Little was born in Reynolds, Georgia. His mother was only 16 years old and struggled with her own challenges. Little spent much of his childhood bouncing between relatives and reform schools, never finding stability or proper guidance. By his teenage years, Little was already displaying troubling behavior. He was sent to the Ohio Boys Industrial School for theft. While there, he experienced severe mistreatment that would shape his later actions and worldview. As an adult, Little developed a pattern of petty crime. He committed burglaries, stole from stores, and drifted from city to city. But beneath these minor offenses, something far darker was developing. Little had an obsession that would define his criminal career. He became fixated on women's necks. He would later describe how even as a young man, he was drawn to this specific feature. If a woman had what he considered an attractive neck, she became a potential target. This fixation wasn't just casual attraction. It consumed his thoughts and eventually dictated his actions. He would study the way necks moved when women spoke or swallowed. The contours and shapes became an obsession he couldn't escape. In the late 1960s, Little was arrested for assault. The victim survived, but the incident taught him a crucial lesson. Living witnesses could identify him. He decided he would never leave a witness alive again. This realization led to the development of his specific technique. He would use only his hands, applying pressure to the neck until his victims lost consciousness and eventually passed away. This method left minimal forensic evidence, especially in an era before DNA testing became widespread. The first confirmed victim lost her life in Miami in January 1970. Her body was found in a shallow grave in the Everglades, but the case went cold almost immediately. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects, and limited forensic technology available. What investigators didn't know was that this marked the beginning of a killing spree that would span the entire country and last for 35 years. Little became strategic about victim selection. He targeted women who were already marginalized by society, women struggling with addiction, women working in certain industries, women whose disappearances might not trigger immediate police investigations. He looked for women who wouldn't be immediately missed, women who existed on the edges of their communities, women whose families might not have resources to push for thorough investigations. Throughout the 1970s, Little moved constantly. He traveled with his longtime companion, Ophelia Jean Dorsey, who supported them through shoplifting. While she stole goods to sell, Little would go out at night claiming he was just socializing. What Dorsey didn't know was that during these outings, Little was hunting. He would visit frequent bars and street corners in various cities: Los Angeles, San Diego, Cleveland, Miami. Each location became part of his hunting ground. His method remained consistent. He would approach women, gain their trust through offers of money or companionship, drive them to isolated areas, and then take their lives. Afterward, he would dispose of their bodies and immediately leave the area, often crossing state lines before sunrise. The 1970s provided perfect conditions for someone like Little. Interstate communication between police departments was limited. Forensic science was still developing. Missing persons reports for marginalized individuals often received minimal follow-up. Little exploited every one of these gaps. He understood that if he kept moving, no single jurisdiction would recognize a pattern. He knew that bodies found weeks after death would yield little useful evidence. The 1980s brought several instances where Little nearly faced justice. In 1982, investigators in Florida linked him to multiple cases. Physical evidence connected him to victims. Witnesses placed him with women who later turned up deceased. When Patricia Mount's body was discovered in a hayfield, investigators found hair fibers and collected witness testimony that pointed directly to Little. He went to trial in 1984. Despite the evidence, the jury found him not guilty. The physical evidence had degraded due to environmental exposure. Witness credibility was questioned. Little walked free once again. Around the same time, a grand jury in another jurisdiction reviewed evidence connecting him to victim Melinda LaPrey. They opted not to indict. These failures in the justice system allowed Little to continue for 2 more decades. How many lives could have been saved if these prosecutions had succeeded? Little also had another close call in Florida. A police officer found him in a vehicle with a deceased woman. Little quickly fabricated a story, and the officer let him leave. By the time the truth became apparent, Little had vanished. These near misses gave Little confidence. He began to believe he was untouchable. As DNA technology advanced in the 1990s, Little should have become more vulnerable to detection. But he had already perfected his method years before this technology became standard. He continued to move between cities, targeting vulnerable women. Texas, Arizona, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi. Each state added to his growing list of victims. By the early 2000s, Little was aging. His physical strength was declining. At age 65, he committed what would be his last known offense in 2005. Not because he wanted to stop, not because he developed remorse, simply because his body could no longer physically carry out the acts. The urges remained. The obsession persisted. But his aging body couldn't execute what his mind still craved. This physical limitation, not moral awakening, ended his 35-year spree. In September 2012, police arrested Little at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, on a drug charge out of California. This seemed like just another minor arrest in Little's long criminal history. But when Little was extradited back to Los Angeles, something unexpected happened. Detectives in Los Angeles had been working cold cases from the 1980s. Detective Mitzi Roberts had dedicated herself to solving these forgotten cases, believing the victims deserved justice regardless of how much time had passed. They had preserved DNA evidence from crime scenes involving 3 victims: Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. When they ran the DNA through databases, they got a match. Samuel Little. Suddenly, 3 unsolved cases from decades earlier had a suspect. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Little's genetic material was found at multiple crime scenes. Investigators worked tirelessly to build the strongest possible case. They tracked down witnesses from 30 years earlier. They reviewed old evidence with fresh eyes. They consulted with forensic experts to ensure the DNA evidence would hold up in court. This time, Little wouldn't talk his way out. In 2014, Little went to trial for these 3 cases. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about seeing Little with the victims shortly before they disappeared. The prosecution presented a methodical case. They showed how Little targeted vulnerable women, how he used the same approach repeatedly, how the DNA evidence conclusively linked him to the crime scenes. The jury deliberated and returned with guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. Samuel Little was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 74, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The families of Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca finally had justice. After decades of waiting, they had answers. But these three women represented only a tiny fraction of Little's victims. For years after his conviction, Little maintained his innocence. He refused to discuss the cases. Then in 2018, something changed. Little was now 78 years old, confined to a wheelchair, and knew he would never leave prison alive. Texas Ranger James Holland approached Little with an offer. Holland specialized in cold cases and had built a reputation for getting confessions from difficult suspects. Holland told Little that if he was willing to talk about unsolved cases, authorities would ensure he wouldn't face the death penalty for any additional confessions. Little agreed. What happened next shocked even the most experienced investigators. When Little started talking, he couldn't stop. He described cases from Florida, Texas, California, Ohio, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas. The list went on and on. He provided specific details about each victim, what they were wearing, where he met them, what their last words were, where he left their bodies, details that only someone who had been there could know. Ranger Holland and other investigators listened in disbelief as Little calmly recounted case after case. He spoke without emotion, describing the events as if he were discussing a trip to the grocery store. By the end of his confessions, Little claimed responsibility for 93 lives taken between 1970 and 2005. This number surpassed every known offender in American history. More than Ted Bundy's estimated 30 victims, more than John Wayne Gacy's 33, more than Gary Ridgway's 49 confirmed victims. Investigators needed to verify each claim before accepting Little's confessions as fact. They began cross-referencing Little's statements with unsolved cases from the appropriate time periods and locations. What they found was stunning. Little's confessions matched cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades. He described details that only the person responsible could know. In one case, he mentioned that a victim had been wearing a wig. Investigators checked the autopsy report from the 1970s. The report noted a wig had been found with the remains. This detail had never been released publicly. In another case, he described the contents of a victim's stomach. The autopsy confirmed undigested carrots and coffee, exactly as Little had stated. Case after case checked out. Investigators also noted what Little didn't claim. When detectives tried to get him to confess to a case from 1998, Little immediately corrected them, stating he was in prison that year. If he was simply trying to inflate his numbers, he would have claimed credit for any case presented to him. Instead, he was precise about which acts he committed and which he didn't. This accuracy convinced investigators that Little was telling the truth. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Little's confessions was his artistic ability. While in prison, Little began drawing portraits of his victims from memory. These weren't rough sketches. They were detailed, careful renderings showing the faces of women he had targeted decades earlier. He drew them with remarkable accuracy, capturing specific features, hairstyles, and expressions. Some drawings depicted victims from the 1970s and 1980s, yet Little rendered them with photographic precision. Investigators distributed these drawings to police departments across the country. Several families came forward, recognizing their loved ones in Little's artwork. These drawings helped solve cases that had been cold for over 40 years. The FBI created a dedicated webpage featuring Little's drawings and information about unidentified victims. Slowly, names were attached to faces. Cold cases were closed. Families received closure. But many drawings still remain unidentified. Women whose families may never know what happened to them. What drove Samuel Little to commit these acts for 35 years? Through extensive interviews, a disturbing picture emerged. Little described his obsession with women's necks. He explained that from a young age, he was fixated on this specific physical feature. This obsession eventually evolved into violence. He described the act of taking someone's life as intimately connected to his own gratification. The two became inseparable in his mind. He didn't want to use weapons. The physical contact was essential to his satisfaction. He needed to feel their necks, watch them struggle, see the fear in their eyes. Psychologists who studied Little's case identified him as an erotic aggression subtype. This is one of the rarest and most dangerous categories, representing only about 10% of such offenders. These individuals derive satisfaction from the act of violence itself. They carefully select vulnerable targets. They act impulsively, but with calculation, and they show no remorse for their actions. Little fit this profile perfectly. He showed no genuine empathy for his victims. He described them in objectifying terms, reducing them to physical features rather than acknowledging their humanity. Little's victims shared common characteristics. They were primarily women of color. Many struggled with addiction. Some worked in certain industries. They lived in low-income neighborhoods where disappearances often went unnoticed. Little deliberately chose women who fit this profile. He knew that investigations into their disappearances would be less thorough. He understood that witnesses from these communities were often dismissed by law enforcement. New York Times best-selling author Gillian Lauren, who interviewed Little extensively, made it her mission to honor these victims. She worked to ensure their stories were told and their lives remembered. Many of the victims remain unidentified even today. They are known only through Little's descriptions and drawings. Their families may never know what happened to them. After his 2014 conviction for 3 cases, Little's confessions opened investigations into dozens more. Prosecutors from multiple states began building cases based on his admissions. Little eventually pleaded guilty to several additional offenses, receiving more life sentences. Each guilty plea brought closure to another family. Each confession solved another cold case that had haunted investigators for decades. By 2019, investigators had confirmed over 60 of his claimed 93 victims. The FBI worked with local jurisdictions to match Little's confessions with unsolved cases. Several families finally received closure about loved ones who had disappeared decades earlier. Mothers, who had spent 40 years wondering what happened to their daughters, finally got answers. But roughly 30 cases remain unconfirmed. Either the bodies were never found, or sufficient evidence couldn't be gathered to definitively link Little to the deaths. These unconfirmed cases represent families still waiting, still hoping, still searching for answers that may never come. Samuel Little died in a California hospital at age 80. He had been serving multiple life sentences and was in declining health for his final years. His death came while investigations were still ongoing into his remaining unconfirmed confessions. With his passing, any hope of solving the remaining cases died as well. Families of potential victims lost the opportunity to hear directly from the person who might have answers about their loved ones. Little died without showing genuine remorse. In his final interviews, he continued to speak about his actions in detached clinical terms. He described the victims as objects rather than human beings. Author Gillian Lauren, who became his next of kin after his family disowned him, was with him near the end. She described a man who remained unrepentant until his final days. Little never acknowledged the full weight of what he had done, never truly grasped the devastation he had caused, never understood the decades of pain experienced by the families of his victims. Samuel Little's case exposed massive failures in the American justice system. He was arrested nearly 100 times throughout his life, but only served 10 years total behind bars. Many of his cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence or unreliable witnesses. Physical evidence degraded before it could be properly analyzed. Different jurisdictions failed to communicate with each other. What might have appeared as a pattern, if viewed together, remained isolated incidents when examined separately. Little exploited every one of these weaknesses. He understood that moving between states would prevent pattern recognition. He knew that certain victims would generate less investigative pressure. The case also highlighted how society's marginalized members receive less protection and justice. The victims Little chose were often dismissed as less important by investigators and prosecutors. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case is how many victims were overlooked for so long. These were women with families, women with hopes and dreams, women who deserved justice and dignity. But because of their circumstances, their disappearances were often treated as low priority. Some cases were closed as overdoses or accidents without thorough investigation. Others simply went cold and were forgotten. It took Little's confessions to bring attention back to these cases. Only then did law enforcement dedicate resources to solving them. This raises uncomfortable questions about which victims receive justice and which are left behind. Little's case led to significant changes in how law enforcement handles investigations. DNA databases became more comprehensive and interconnected. Cold case units received additional funding and resources. Training programs now emphasize the importance of thorough investigation, regardless of victim background. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program expanded its capabilities to better identify patterns across jurisdictions. Interstate communication improved dramatically. Additionally, advocacy groups have worked to ensure that all victims receive equal attention and justice, regardless of their circumstances. But these changes came too late for the 93 women Little claimed to have harmed. They paid the ultimate price for a system that failed to protect them. Even with Little's confessions, mysteries remain. Approximately 30 of his claimed victims have never been identified or confirmed. Their families may never know what happened to them. Some investigators believe Little may have been responsible for even more cases than he confessed to. There may be victims he simply forgot about, or chose not to mention. We'll never know the complete truth. With Little's death, those answers died with him. What we do know is that Samuel Little represents one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. A predator who operated in plain sight for 35 years. A system that failed to protect the vulnerable. 93 victims whose lives were stolen. And approximately 30 families still waiting for answers that may never come. This case reminds us of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable in our communities. Every person deserves safety, dignity, and justice, regardless of their circumstances. If this story moved you, share it to raise awareness about these forgotten victims. Subscribe to stay informed about true crime cases that expose the failures we must address to prevent future tragedies.